Hi, it's Courtney, America's Jewish mother. Welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to be sharing with you my reading wrap-up from the month of April. I read 10 books in April, which is pretty good for me considering that I also had all of the grading to do toward the end. So I'm going to share them with you in roughly the order in which I read them. So the first book that I finished was one that I actually had started in mid-March, and this is a collection of Seamus Heaney's selected poems from 1966 to 1996 called Opened Ground. And as you can see, it's pretty big. It's, I think, over 450 pages, or close to 450 pages. Yeah, 430. So anyway, it was going to take me a while to get through a collection of poetry that was this big. So I started this around mid-March and I finished this around the second week of April. So yeah, it was good. I didn't like it as much as maybe I was hoping to like it. I mean, it's not bad or anything, but again, I just didn't love it kind of like I wanted to. Also, I have to say, for a collection of selected poems that spans about 30 years, I didn't necessarily see a lot of common themes sort of coming through in the poems. Although I will say a lot of them have to do with sort of rural imagery in Ireland and things of that sort, but they're not all nature oriented. Some of them also have to do with family and friends and things like that. I think a lot of Seamus Heaney's identity as a poet is somewhat bound up with this fact that his family seems to come from rural Ireland, where working the earth is highly valued, and he's and he's a poet, so that's not a tradition he can carry on. And I think maybe to a certain extent he feels some sense of guilt about that, as exemplified by, I think it's actually the first poem in here, which is called Digging, which I would like to read if you will indulge me. And it's also pretty representative of his work. Digging. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father, digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep, to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. So yeah, if you enjoyed that poem, you'll get stuff like that in this collection. So I did like it. I gave it 3.5 stars. But again, I just didn't love it as much as I was kind of hoping to. So, alright, the next book I finished, I do not have with me to hold up a physical copy of it because I've already taken it back to my office bookcase, but the next book I read was Taiye Selasi's Ghana Must Go. And this is a novel that was published in the early, I think it was published in the early 2010s, somewhere around maybe 2010, 2012, something like that. But anyway, so it's centered around this family who, the father and mother originally from Nigeria. Actually, the mother's not originally from Nigeria. No. The mother's originally from Nigeria. The father's from Ghana. Yes. Okay. So, but anyway, so it's centered around the death of the patriarch of this family that occurs pretty much in the opening of the book. So I'm not giving anything away. But you learn throughout the course of the novel that the family has been scattered both physically and also emotionally from each other. There's been a lot of estrangement too. So it's the ex-wife, because they were no longer married when the father died. The ex-wife and their 4 adult children all reconvene in Ghana for the funeral of the patriarch of the family. And so you kind of learn along the way what the stories of each of the individual grown children are, what the mother's story is, what happened between her and the father. And you also get a sense of why there's this emotional and physical distance between them all. I will say, trigger warning, there is some dark stuff that comes out toward the end of this book. So just be prepared for some dark stuff. The other thing about this book is that it's written in a style that I would describe as very poetic, in the sense that a lot of the writing is very fragmentary. So there's not full, proper grammatical sentences sometimes. It's just a thought, like you would see in a poem, which is why I describe it as poetic. And I think for a collection of poetry, that would be one thing, but for an entire novel that's over 300 pages, that definitely, the style of the writing grated on my nerves after a while, because I need there to be full grammatical sentences in a novel. But anyway, I did like it. I did feel that the characters were very well-rounded and fully fleshed out. I felt like I understood where all of them were coming from. And I got a good sense of all of the individual children. So 3.5 stars for that. The next book I read was Theodore Roethke's collected poems. And these span from the first collection he published in 1941 through the last full collection of his poems, which came out in 1964. It also includes about a dozen poems that did not appear in any of his full-on collections, and I guess were maybe previously unpublished. This I gave 4 stars to. It was quite a ride. So I really never knew what I was going to get from one page to the next with this collection, and I think poetry is a good place to explore language and its use. I really enjoyed that about this collection. So some of the poems I felt like were humorous and very straightforward in their structure and or themes, and some of them were like a fever dream and I had no idea what was happening, but I was here for it. It kept me entertained. It kept me on my toes. I didn't know what was coming from one page to the next, like I said. So if you are someone who does not mind poetry in numerous forms, both highly structured in the form of, say, a sonnet or an ode, but then also unstructured in blank verse that reads like a fever dream where you're not even sure exactly what's happening, you enjoy that sort of linguistic play, then I would recommend this. I really liked it. Like I said, I gave it 4 stars because it kept me on my toes. So the next book I read, I also do not have a physical copy to hold up, but this was Robin DiAngelo's nonfiction book, Fragility, Why It's So Hard for white people to talk about racism, or why it's so hard to talk to white people about racism. Whatever, something like that. I'll put the title over here. So, anyway, I thought this book was fabulous. I gave it 4.5 stars. It was actually the best book I read in April. So, if you are someone who is white and lives in the United States, this book should be required reading, period. Especially if you are someone who considers yourself progressive, liberal, and or woke. because Robin DiAngelo in this book, really she gears it toward people who consider themselves progressive and liberal. So DiAngelo's point is really to show how even people who think that white people who think that we're liberal and progressive are also susceptible to this title term, white fragility, which is reacting very defensively and swiftly anytime we're challenged in terms of saying that we did something that could be construed as racist, or we said something that could be construed as racist. And she talks a lot about how we're, as white people living in the United States, we're inculcated into a culture that is really rooted in white supremacy, and how you can't get away from that. So there's really you're not going to be perfect. You're not going to be not racist. You will say things that are racist occasionally. You will do things that are racist occasionally. And she actually uses herself as an example, which I appreciated. It's not like she's writing this book saying, hey, all you other white people who aren't woke like me. That's not what she's doing. So I liked that about it. So yeah, I think everyone should read this book if you're white and live in the United States. 4.5 stars. The only thing I did not like about it is there's one chapter in, like, it's in the middle of the book, like, kind of it comes up randomly, where she spends the whole chapter talking about Pierre Bourdieu and habitus. And I was like, ugh, theory. And I really didn't understand why she put it there all of a sudden. I feel like if you were going to have a theoretical discussion, or you were going to underpin your discussion of white fragility to theory, it would make more sense to do that at the beginning and then refer back to it periodically. And I also don't really think it added anything of value. So other than the one chapter where she talks about Pierre Bourdieu and habitus, I felt like the book was otherwise very accessible, very readable. It made a lot of sense. I also listened to it on audiobook. So if you're someone who has trouble reading nonfiction for, extended periods of time. I mean, I think the book itself is short. It's like 150 pages, but yeah, it was like 6.5 hours on audiobook. I breezed through the whole thing. It was awesome. 4.5 stars. The next book I read was Amor, Towles, A Gentleman in Moscow. And this was on the recommendation of an old coworker of mine. I think she recommended this probably about a year ago, and then I bought it and just finally got around to reading it. And I have to say, this was excellent quarantine reading, because it is centered around a count, Alexander Rostov, who in 1922 is sentenced by the Soviet government to house arrest in the Hotel Metropole where he resides for basically the rest of his life for writing potentially subversive poetry. So yeah, it's about this guy who's stuck in place and can't leave the hotel by law, right? So very appropriate quarantine reading. This book was super charming. It's not anything real deep, or anything like that, but it's very charming. The Count is an extremely likable and sympathetic character. You just kind of see his adventures over the course of about 30 years of his living in this hotel, and there's a lot of stuff that happens. You would be surprised how much stuff happens. But yeah, it was really good. The only thing I kind of didn't like about it is I felt like the Count was too perfect. Like, he always does the right and honorable thing. There's never a moment where you see him do anything that you think is bad or wrong or questionable, and so I don't really actually feel like there's a ton of growth from him as a character. He pretty much remains static throughout, although again, he's very charming and very likable. But I did not feel that this was a book that had like really fully well-rounded and fleshed out characters, because everyone who was a good person was just good, and that was all the dimensions to that. But again, I'm not knocking it. I liked it a lot. 4 stars, super charming. The next book I finished was a collection of plays by Clifford Odets called Waiting for Lefty and Other Plays. And this had 6 of Clifford Odets' plays. If you've never heard of Clifford Odets, he was a fairly well-known Jewish playwright in the 1930s and 40s until he was supplanted by more famous people like Eugene O'Neill and Tennessee Williams. And one of the blurbs on the back of this calls him the American Chekhov. And I gotta say, I did not like this collection overall. And in fact, after I'd read 2 of the plays and didn't enjoy them, I really strongly considered DNFing this, but I kind of was just like, well, I just want to see, like, there could be a play that I like. And so out of the 6 plays, I ended up enjoying 2 of them. One of them, I was like, it's okay, it's not great. And then the other 3, I was like, nah, these are totally forgettable. Characters are basically interchangeable. I don't feel like they're good. So overall, I gave this collection 2.5 stars. The ones that I really liked were Till the Day I Die. That I thought was the best play in the collection. It's also a 1-act play and it's quite short. So I would also recommend Golden Boy, which is about an aspiring boxer. And then Rocket to the Moon was the one I was like, well, this is okay, but I didn't really love the ending. It's about a dentist. So yes, I don't recommend it overall. 2.5 stars. If you want to read it, you should read Till the Day I Die, though. Oh, the other thing I'll say about Clifford Odets before I move on is that he's really well known for agitprop or sort of political propaganda. He was big into socialism, as were a lot of American Jews in the 1920s and 30s. So I would read him for sort of the historical value of political theater more than I would character development or enjoyable plots or anything like that. All right, moving on. The next book I read was a short collection of poetry by Charles Wright called Chickamauga. This is just a single collection, so it was like not even 100 pages long. Now I read Charles Wright's a big book like the Seamus Heaney book of his selected poems called By and By, and I really loved that. It was like one of the best books of poetry I read last year. I gave it 4.5 stars. So I went into Chickamauga with high expectations, and of course, when you go into a book with high expectations, you're probably going to be disappointed. So I was a little let down. And again, I feel the same way about this as I felt about the Seamus Heaney poems. They're not bad. They are good poems. I just didn't love them as much as I was hoping to. So I think I gave this 3.5 stars. So one poem I will read out of this. It's actually the last poem in the collection called Yard Work, so I think this is a good sort of representative example of Charles Wright's poetry in this collection. So if you enjoy this poem that I'm about to read, then I think you would enjoy this collection. Yard Work. I think that someone will remember us in another time, Sappho once said, more or less. Her words caught between the tongue's tip and the first edge of the invisible. I hope so, myself now caught between the edge of the landscape and the absolute, which is the same place and the same sound that she made. Meanwhile, let's stick to business. Everything else does. The landscape, the absolute, the invisible. My job is yard work. I take this inchworm, for instance, and move it from here to there. So a lot of these poems are concerned with aging, death, nature, the ineffability, is that the word I want? The insubstantialness of language to describe our thoughts and feelings. Those are a lot of Wright's major themes. So they're definitely here. Again, they're good poems. 3.5 stars. I recommend it. I just didn't love it as much as I wanted. All right. The next book I read, I do not have a physical copy to show, but I will put the title and author over here. And it was Daniel Silva's The Kill Artist, and this is the first book in his Gabriel Allon series, which he's like 19 or 20 books into. He's been putting these out since about one a year since 2000. So it concerns Gabriel Allon, who is an ex-Mossad agent. He's an art restorer by trade, but he keeps getting sucked back into missions for the Office, as it's called in Tel Aviv, which is headed by a guy named Ari Shamron, clear stand-in for Ariel Sharon. So anyway, so because The Kill Artist is the first book in the series, there's a lot of character setup, right? Like you sort of learn about Gabriel Allon's tragic past, and you learn about various missions that he went on for the office when he was still an active agent, and you learn about his relationship with Ari Shamron. But the main plot of the book centers around this Palestinian terrorist named Tariq. He's just Tariq, like Madonna or Cher. Tariq. Doesn't have a last name. Anyway, so it centers around this terrorist named Tariq, who is an old nemesis of Allon, which is of course why he then gets sucked back into this mission to try to go and take Tariq down. So you learn about their previous relationship, and why they're mortal enemies of one another, and each wants the other one to die. I will say the pacing of this book is very good. I was definitely on the edge of my seat in the last like half to third of the book to be like, what's gonna happen, right? So it's definitely good in terms of pacing. The writing it's fine. It's not really great or anything to write home about, but you know, for like a fun, just page turner spy thriller series, it's good stuff. I was prepared originally to rate this book at 3.5 stars, but then there was a conversation that happened at the end of the book where basically it just makes it seem like one of the characters is playing 4D chess and orchestrating all things at all times that I just thought really stretched the reaches of believability. So I then knocked it down to 3.25 stars. I will say I'm reading the second book in the series, The English Assassin, right now, and I'm liking it a lot better so far. But again, it's you know, it's the first book in the series. You got to cut Daniel Silva a little slack because he's trying to fit in all of these character backstories and stuff like that. But again, I felt like the pacing was quite good, especially toward the end. All right, the next book I read was a collection of short stories by Toni Cade Bambara called Gorilla My Love. This was originally published in, I'm thinking 1970 something. Oh, wow. All right, earlier than I thought, 1960. All right. So this is a collection of 15 short stories that are mainly centered around African-American children and young adults, in mostly urban settings, but sometimes also rural. I definitely feel like Bambara does a good job capturing how children think about the world and what happens to sort of shake their values and trust and faith in the world around them and in the adults around them. All of the narrative voices here are very strong. I did not find any of them to be unbelievable. But of course, being a short story collection, right, like not all of the stories are winners. So I found about like half of the 15 stories quite compelling. And then the other half, I was like, I'm not really sure what I was supposed to take away from this. But I would recommend it if you like short stories, especially ones that are mainly centered around children or young adults, and ones that have a sort of strong narrative voice. So 3.5 stars. All right, and then the last book I read in April was Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. So I had read Mrs. Dalloway a number of years ago, and I remember liking it. So anyway, so I read this, and I am not a real big fan of Virginia Woolf's stream of consciousness style, which of course, being Virginia Woolf, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get that in Mrs. Dalloway, you're going to get that To the Lighthouse, and probably anything she writes. So I was not a huge fan of that, but, you know, that's her style. I did like this book a lot. I feel like it does a lot it has a lot of good insights about human relationships and how people interact with each other. And it also says some interesting things about the passing of time and what are the meanings of our individual lives, and how are we remembered by people after we're gone. So this book has a decent sized cast of characters, but we mainly follow Mrs. Ramsay and Lily Briscoe, who are two women who are leading in some ways sort of opposite lives. Like Mrs. Ramsay is this middle-aged woman who's very concerned with the needs of her family and domestic life. And Lily Briscoe is in her 30s. She's single. She's a painter. And she just does not interact with people with the same ease and intuitive femininity, let's say, that Mrs. Ramsay does. And so for that reason, Lily's a little bit fascinated with Mrs. Ramsay. The writing is quite good. A lot of lines that were very beautiful that stuck out to me. A lot of, like I said, great insights about human relationships and interactions. The one thing that I really didn't like about this is the fact that it's too centered around men. So even for the fact that it mainly follows the perspectives of Mrs. Ramsay and Lily Briscoe, they're pretty much almost always thinking about men, which I feel like sort of undercuts the more feminist thrust of the book. And Lily Briscoe is literally the only character who's not thinking about men 24/7. But, you know, she still thinks about men quite a good bit too. So other than that, I liked it quite a bit. It's very insightful. I really like books that have a lot to say about our interactions with each other, so 4 stars. Alright, so that is my April reading wrap-up. Thank you for watching. If you have read any of these books or have an interest in reading them, feel free to drop me a comment down below, especially if you disagree with my take on any of them. Let's discuss it. So yeah, I hope everyone is staying healthy and well. I hope you've been doing some good reading. And remember, would it kill you to call your mother?